He laughed, the kind of laugh that fills a room with cold, sharp echoes, a mockery wrapped in a suit that screams power. The millionaire at the gleaming reception desk laughed at the concierge standing firm in the marble lobby of the Parkside Tower, the tallest building in downtown Chicago. Defending a woman, really? That's what you think your job is? His voice dripped with disdain and a contempt that seemed to isolate the janitor further from the shiny world of wealth he cleaned every night. Silence followed. A heaviness hung in the air, thicker than the cold winter wind blasting through the glass doors. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a hallway, checking the cameras, or locking the building doors for the night. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will shake your heart. Because sometimes the people who see everything are the ones who remain invisible. Sometimes the hands that hold everything together are the ones nobody notices. And sometimes the truth waits patiently in the shadows, carried by a man whose dignity runs deeper than any fortune built on cruelty. This is the story of Samuel Martinez, a man whose uniform was simple, stained, worn, yet always buttoned with dignity. At 58, his weathered hands bore the marks of decades spent polishing floors that reflected back the arrogance of those who walked above him. Every morning before dawn, he'd catch the Blue Line train from his modest apartment in Pilsen, clutching a thermos filled with weak coffee and yesterday's leftover tamales. His neighbor, Mrs. Esperanza, insisted on packing for him. The train would rumble through the heart of Chicago, carrying construction workers, hospital staff, and people like Samuel, the invisible army that keeps a city running while the wealthy sleep in their penthouses. At Parkside Tower, a 60-story monument to capitalism that pierced the Chicago skyline like a glass and steel needle, Samuel was nothing more than background noise beneath the opulent chandeliers and glossy Italian marble surfaces. The building housed investment firms managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions, cryptocurrency trading floors where fortunes were made and lost with a single click, and offices where men in $1,000 suits moved money like chess pieces across international markets. Yet none of them saw Samuel as he moved through their world, his keys jingling softly, his mop leaving trails of cleanliness in his wake. But Samuel saw everything. From the way Ms. Victoria Daniels, the secretary in the penthouse office, nervously twisted her diamond tennis bracelet whenever the quarterly reports came in, to the hurried footsteps of junior analysts who clutched their phones like lifelines while Bitcoin prices fluctuated wildly on their screens. He noticed how Mr. Roland Pierce, the building's primary tenant and a hedge fund manager whose net worth exceeded $200 million, held court in the marble lobby like a modern emperor, surrounded by sycophants who laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny and nodded too eagerly at opinions that shifted with the stock market. Samuel absorbed every whispered conversation about offshore accounts, every nervous glance when the SEC regulations tightened, every celebration when a particularly risky investment in emerging markets paid dividends that could buy small countries. He was the guardian of silence, patient and dignified, moving through a world of wealth that treated him as invisible furniture. His presence was as constant as the hum of the building's climate control system, as reliable as the sunrise over Lake Michigan, and as overlooked as the security cameras that recorded everything but revealed nothing. In the early morning hours, when the building belonged to the cleaning crew, Samuel would walk the empty corridors with a reverence that bordered on the spiritual. He knew every scratch on every mahogany door, every scuff mark on the marble that told a story of hurried meetings and desperate phone calls. The elevator that serviced the penthouse had been witness to more confessions than a Catholic church, mergers discussed in whispers, insider trading hinted at with coded language, and family fortunes gambled away on cryptocurrency speculation that went wrong. Samuel heard it all, absorbed it like a human sponge, but never spoke of what he knew. His own financial situation was modest to the point of austerity. His monthly salary barely covered rent, utilities, and groceries, leaving nothing for savings or the kind of investments that made the residents of Parkside Tower wealthy beyond imagination. Yet, Samuel possessed something they didn't, a moral compass that pointed true north regardless of how much money was at stake. He had learned through decades of service that dignity wasn't something you could purchase with dollars or euros or Bitcoin. It was something you carried in your spine, in the way you met people's eyes, in the quiet strength of doing right when no one was watching. The building's residents began their day as Samuel ended his shift, rushing past him in expensive suits that cost more than his monthly income. They spoke in rapid bursts about stock options and portfolio diversification, their phones constantly buzzing with alerts from trading apps that tracked their wealth in real time. To them, Samuel was part of the infrastructure, as necessary and invisible as the electrical wiring or the building's foundation. They might acknowledge him with a distracted nod if they were feeling particularly generous, but mostly he existed in their peripheral vision. A gray uniformed ghost who ensured their golden world remained spotless. But invisibility, Samuel had learned, was sometimes a superpower. When you're invisible, people forget you have ears. They forget you have eyes. They forget you have a memory that catalogs every detail, every inconsistency, every moment when their carefully constructed facades slip to reveal the truth underneath. Samuel had become a living archive of secrets, a repository of knowledge that could topple empires built on arrogance and maintained through willful blindness to the humanity of others. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. Gray skies hanging low over Chicago like a dirty blanket, slush melting on Michigan Avenue as pedestrians hurried past with their heads down against the bitter February wind. The morning had started like any other, with Samuel arriving at Parkside Tower at 5 a.m. sharp, his breath visible in small puffs as he unlocked the service entrance and began his methodical routine of preparing the building for another day of high-stakes capitalism. Clara Morales was 26 years old, fresh out of Northwestern with a degree in computer science and a job at a small tech startup called Cartwell Technologies. She had been working 60-hour weeks trying to land her company's first major contract, and today's meeting with Pierce Holdings was supposed to be her breakthrough moment, the kind of deal that could transform a struggling startup into a serious player in Chicago's competitive tech landscape. Clara had prepared for weeks, researching every aspect of Pierce's investment portfolio, studying market trends in cryptocurrency and digital assets, crafting a presentation that she believed could secure the funding her company desperately needed. She arrived at Parkside Tower at 8:15 a.m., 15 minutes early for her appointment, wearing her best suit, a navy blue ensemble from Target that she'd bought specifically for important meetings. Her portfolio, clutched tightly in her hands, contained months of work, technical specifications, market analyses, projected returns on investment that could potentially yield millions in profit for the right investor. But when she approached the security desk in the lobby, her day began to unravel. Marcus Washington, the daytime security guard, was a man whose authority consisted entirely of standing behind a marble counter and deciding who deserved access to the building's upper floors. He looked at Clara with the kind of skeptical assessment usually reserved for door-to-door salespeople or protesters trying to gain entry to corporate headquarters. "Name?" he asked, his tone suggesting that whatever answer she gave would be insufficient. "Clara Morales from Cartwell Technologies. I have a 9 o'clock appointment with Mr. Pierce's office," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of nervousness in her chest. She had practiced this moment, prepared for the intimidating atmosphere of wealth that surrounded her, but she hadn't prepared for the immediate challenge to her right to be there. Marcus scrolled through his computer screen with deliberate slowness, his finger tracing down a list of appointments while Clara waited. The lobby around them buzzed with the morning energy of high finance, men and women in expensive suits striding purposefully toward elevators, their conversations peppered with references to market volatility and investment strategies. Clara felt increasingly out of place, her target suit and nervous demeanor marking her as an outsider in this world of inherited wealth and hedge fund profits. "I don't see you on the list," Marcus announced with a finality that suggested the conversation was over. "You'll need to contact the office and confirm your appointment before I can let you up." But Clara had emails. She had confirmation messages, timestamps, and a paper trail that proved beyond doubt that her meeting was legitimate. As she fumbled with her phone, trying to pull up the electronic evidence while her hands trembled slightly from nerves and cold, several employees from Pierce Holdings gathered near the elevator banks. They watched the scene unfold with the casual cruelty of people who had never been denied entry anywhere, their whispered comments carrying just far enough for Clara to hear fragments. "Looks nervous, probably another wannabe, waste of Mr. Pierce's time." It was then that Samuel emerged from the service corridor, pushing his cleaning cart with the same quiet dignity he brought to every task. He had been restocking supplies in the utility closet when he heard the commotion, and something about the young woman's distressed voice drew his attention. Samuel had a memory like a steel trap when it came to the building's operations, and he distinctly remembered seeing Clara's name on the appointment roster when he had cleaned Mr. Pierce's office the previous evening. "She's with Cartwell Tech," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the lobby's background noise. "I've seen the appointment scheduled for 9 o'clock. The effect of Samuel's intervention was immediate and electric. Mr. Pierce, who had been crossing the lobby on his way to the elevator, stopped mid-stride and turned toward the security desk with the slow, deliberate movement of a predator who had just identified prey. Roland Pierce was 62 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of presence that comes from controlling vast amounts of money for most of one's adult life. His net worth fluctuated daily with market conditions, but rarely dipped below the $300 million mark. He owned properties in Manhattan, Miami, and Aspen, drove cars that cost more than most people's houses, and had grown accustomed to a level of deference that bordered on worship. "Samuel," Mr. Pierce said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had been honed in boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions were made before lunch, "you're a janitor, not a gatekeeper. I suggest you mind your place, or I'll find someone who knows theirs." The words hung in the marble and gold lobby like a toxic cloud. The cruel laughter that followed, from Pierce, from his employees, from Marcus, who was eager to align himself with power, echoed off the polished surfaces and seemed to trap Clara and Samuel in a bubble of humiliation. Other building occupants slowed their purposeful strides to observe the spectacle, some with embarrassment, others with the morbid fascination of witnesses to a public execution. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't leave. Samuel's simple defense of her right to be there had transformed him from an invisible man into a target, but it had also revealed something crucial about the character of both the defender and the defended. In a world where everything was measured in dollars and market share, Samuel had offered something priceless, basic human dignity and respect for truth. The humiliation that followed was systematic and thorough. Pierce made sure that everyone in the lobby understood the hierarchy at play, the distance between those who mattered and those who merely served. Samuel absorbed it all in silence, his weathered hands steady on his cart, his eyes reflecting decades of similar moments when his humanity had been casually dismissed in favor of maintaining someone else's sense of superiority. But Clara didn't forget. As she was eventually escorted to her meeting, 15 minutes late and emotionally rattled, she carried with her the image of a man who had risked his job to defend a stranger's dignity. The meeting itself was a disaster, her presentation undermined by her obvious distress and Pierce's apparent lack of interest in anything she had to say about emerging technologies or cryptocurrency markets. By 10:30, she was back on the street, her portfolio full of rejected dreams, but her mind focused on the custodian who had been willing to stand up for what was right. Samuel continued his work that day with the same methodical precision he brought to every task, but something had shifted in the building's atmosphere. The employees who had witnessed the lobby scene treated him with a combination of pity and contempt, as if his willingness to speak up had confirmed their suspicions about his lack of understanding regarding proper boundaries. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms, resumed in whispers when he left. The invisible man had made himself visible, and the consequence was a heightened awareness of his outsider status in their world of wealth and power. Yet Samuel held his silence about what he knew, and he knew more than any of them suspected. Years of cleaning offices after hours had given him access to documents left carelessly on desks, conversations recorded by security systems he maintained, and the kind of intimate knowledge about the building's operations that comes from being present but overlooked. He knew about Pierce's questionable investment strategies, the way certain cryptocurrency transactions were structured to avoid regulatory oversight, and the offshore accounts that held millions in profits that had never been properly reported to tax authorities. The building itself seemed to respond to the tension, settling into its foundation with creaks and sighs that spoke of secrets held too long. The elevator that Samuel serviced daily carried whispers of concern about government investigations into high-frequency trading, about SEC inquiries that were getting uncomfortably specific, and about the kind of financial irregularities that could transform millionaires into defendants faster than a market crash could wipe out portfolios. Samuel absorbed it all, cataloged it in his remarkable memory, and waited. Because he had learned, through 5 decades of life and 3 decades of service, that truth has its own timeline. Justice might be slow, but it was as inevitable as the sunrise over Lake Michigan, as certain as the changing of seasons in the Midwest, as reliable as the morning train that carried him from his modest world to theirs every day before dawn. The weeks that followed Clara's disastrous meeting settled into a routine of calculated cruelty. Pierce Holdings made it clear that Samuel's intervention had been noted and would not be forgotten. His work schedule was altered to minimize his visibility during business hours. His responsibilities were increased while his resources remained the same, and his presence was treated as an ongoing inconvenience that management was generously tolerating rather than eliminating entirely. But tolerance in a world built on profit margins and quarterly earnings reports is a luxury that can be withdrawn at any moment. And Samuel, despite his decades of faithful service and intimate knowledge of every corner of Parkside Tower, was about to learn just how quickly invisibility could transform into expendability when the balance sheets demanded a scapegoat. The expensive vase arrived on a Thursday morning in March, delivered by the same company that handled all of Pierce Holdings' high-value acquisitions. It was a Ming Dynasty piece, authenticated and insured for $200,000, purchased at auction as part of Pierce's growing collection of Asian antiquities. The vase was intended for display in the penthouse conference room, where it would serve as both decoration and demonstration of the kind of wealth that serious investors could accumulate through careful portfolio management and strategic cryptocurrency investments. Samuel watched the delivery from across the lobby, noting the nervous energy of the courier service representatives as they carefully transported their precious cargo toward the elevator banks. The vase was beautiful in the way that only objects created centuries ago by master craftsmen could be. Its surface decorated with dragons and phoenixes that seemed to dance around the ceramic curves. Its monetary value secondary to its artistic and historical significance. The accident, when it came, was swift and devastating. James Murphy, a 24-year-old courier making his first delivery to Parkside Tower, had been rushing to complete his route before the afternoon traffic made downtown Chicago impassable. He was wheeling the carefully packaged vase toward the elevator when his cart caught on an uneven seam in the marble flooring, a tiny imperfection that Samuel had noted weeks earlier and reported for repair, only to have the work order buried in a bureaucratic maze of cost-benefit analyses and deferred maintenance schedules. The cart lurched, the vase shifted, and in the horrifying slow motion that accompanies irreversible disasters, $200,000 of irreplaceable art crashed to the floor in a symphony of shattering ceramic that seemed to echo through every floor of the building. James Murphy stood frozen in the aftermath, his face drained of color as he stared at the scattered remnants of centuries-old craftsmanship. The lobby fell silent except for the usual background hum of HVAC systems and the distant sound of Chicago traffic. Even the elevator music seemed to pause in respect for the magnitude of the destruction. Samuel crossed the lobby immediately, not to gawk at the disaster, but to begin the practical process of containment and cleanup. His instincts, honed by decades of dealing with the aftermath of human carelessness and mechanical failure, kicked in automatically. He began cordoning off the area to prevent people from walking through the debris, his movements efficient and professional despite the chaos around him. What Samuel didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the building's security system had been experiencing intermittent recording failures for the past month. A software glitch in the digital storage system had been corrupting video files randomly, creating gaps in surveillance coverage that the building's management company had been meaning to address but hadn't prioritized due to the expense involved in upgrading to newer technology. The security camera that should have clearly recorded the accident had malfunctioned at precisely the wrong moment, creating a digital blind spot that would later be filled with assumptions, prejudices, and the kind of convenient narrative that powerful people construct when they need someone to blame for expensive mistakes. By the time Mr. Pierce arrived in the lobby 20 minutes later, summoned by frantic phone calls from his staff, the scene had been transformed from an accident into a crime scene in the minds of those who needed to assign responsibility for the financial loss. Pierce's face cycled through emotions as he processed the destruction, shock, rage, calculated assessment, and finally, the cold determination of someone accustomed to making problems disappear through the strategic application of money and influence. "How did this happen?" Pierce demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose personal wealth exceeded the GDP of small nations. The question was directed at Marcus Washington, who had witnessed the accident but understood that his job security depended on providing answers that aligned with management's preferred narrative rather than inconvenient facts. The delivery was going fine until Marcus paused, his eyes finding Samuel, who was still methodically cleaning up ceramic fragments with the same careful attention he brought to every task. Until Samuel here started moving around the area, must have distracted the courier somehow. The lie was born in that moment of cowardice, nurtured by fear and ambition, and grew stronger with each repetition. Within an hour, Samuel had been transformed from the person trying to prevent people from getting hurt by walking through broken ceramic into the primary suspect in the vase's destruction. The security footage, such as it was, showed Samuel in the vicinity of the accident, because of course he worked in the building, but the crucial moments of the actual incident existed only in a digital void created by malfunctioning equipment. Samuel defended himself with quiet dignity, explaining his movements and his motivations to anyone willing to listen. But in a world where truth is less important than liability management, and where a janitor's word carries no weight against the combined testimony of security guards, building management, and millionaire investors, Samuel's version of events became an inconvenient minority opinion that was steadily overwhelmed by the official story. Pierce Holdings, advised by lawyers who specialized in minimizing corporate liability while maximizing damage awards, offered Samuel a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. He could resign quietly, accepting responsibility for the incident and waiving any right to legal action, or he could face a formal hearing where his 3-decade career would be dissected by attorneys whose hourly rates exceeded his monthly salary. The hearing would have been a foregone conclusion. Samuel understood this with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of watching powerful people reshape reality to suit their financial interests. His resignation letter was brief, professional, and devoid of bitterness, because Samuel had learned that dignity couldn't be taken from you unless you surrendered it willingly. On his final day at Parkside Tower, Samuel cleaned his assigned areas with the same meticulous care he had brought to every day of his career. He emptied trash cans that contained the discarded remains of million-dollar deals, polished surfaces that reflected the faces of people who had never learned his name, and locked doors behind which secrets worth more than his lifetime salary continued to multiply like cancer cells in the darkness. But Samuel took something with him as he left Parkside Tower for the final time. A small USB drive containing security footage from a camera that building management had forgotten existed. Hidden in a utility closet and connected to an old backup system that had been scheduled for removal but never actually disconnected, this camera had recorded the truth of what happened to the Ming vase with perfect clarity. Samuel had discovered the footage 3 days after his resignation while returning to collect personal items from his locker in the basement. The image quality was grainy but unmistakable. James Murphy, rushing with his cart, catching the wheel on the uneven marble, the vase toppling despite his desperate attempt to catch it, and Samuel entering the frame only after the destruction was complete, motivated by nothing more than his instinct to help and protect others from additional harm. The truth, preserved in digital format on a device smaller than a business card, waited in Samuel's modest apartment while he searched for new employment in a job market that had little use for 58-year-old custodians with gaps in their employment history, and references from former employers who were more interested in protecting their legal liability than providing honest assessments of character and competence. 6 months passed like a long, cold winter that refused to acknowledge spring. Samuel's savings, never substantial to begin with, dwindled as he paid rent and utilities while submitting job applications to office buildings, shopping centers, and apartment complexes throughout Chicago and its suburbs. His unemployment benefits provided minimal assistance, and his pride prevented him from accepting the charity that his neighbors in Pilsen tried to offer through casseroles delivered with elaborate excuses and small loans presented as forgotten debts repaid. During those long nights in his apartment, Samuel studied the security footage with the dedication of a detective working a cold case. He wasn't seeking revenge. Revenge was a luxury he couldn't afford, and a poison he refused to swallow. Instead, he was documenting truth with the same methodical precision he had brought to his custodial duties, cataloging evidence not for personal vindication, but because truth, he believed, had its own intrinsic value that transcended individual circumstances. Meanwhile, 8 floors above the streets of Chicago, Pierce Holdings continued its operations with the confident arrogance of an organization that believed its wealth and influence made it immune to consequences. The Ming vase had been written off as a business loss, its destruction converted into a tax deduction that actually improved the company's fourth-quarter financial position. Samuel's departure had been explained to building residents as a mutual agreement following an unfortunate incident, and his replacement, a younger man with no memory of the building's history or secrets, performed his duties with mechanical efficiency, but without Samuel's observational skills or institutional knowledge. But success built on foundations of cruelty and deception carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The financial markets that had made Pierce Holdings wealthy were beginning to shift in ways that exposed the weaknesses in investment strategies based more on short-term profits than long-term sustainability. The cryptocurrency boom that had generated hundreds of millions in paper profits was starting to show signs of the volatility that had always been inherent in digital assets. Government regulators, particularly the SEC and IRS, were beginning to scrutinize trading patterns and tax reporting with the kind of attention that made wealthy investors nervous about their offshore account structures and creative interpretation of capital gains regulations. Pierce's personal wealth, built on leveraged investments and cryptocurrency speculation, was more vulnerable than the quarterly report suggested. His lifestyle, the Manhattan penthouse, the Miami beach house, the collection of classic cars that cost more than most people's houses, was financed through a complex web of loans, credit arrangements, and financial instruments that required constant market performance to remain sustainable. When the first margin call came in September, 18 months after Samuel's departure, Pierce treated it as a temporary inconvenience that could be resolved through portfolio adjustments and strategic asset sales. The second margin call, arriving 3 weeks later, required more dramatic action, liquidating cryptocurrency holdings at less favorable prices and borrowing against real estate assets that were themselves showing signs of market weakness. By December, the financial reality that Pierce had been avoiding through creative accounting and optimistic projections could no longer be ignored. The hedge fund was facing redemption requests from nervous investors, tax audits from federal agencies that had grown suspicious of certain trading patterns, and the kind of legal scrutiny that transforms successful businessmen into defendants in white-collar crime cases. Claire Wu was 29 years old, an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune whose specialty was financial crime and corporate corruption. She had been following unusual patterns in cryptocurrency trading for months, tracking digital breadcrumbs that suggested money laundering and tax evasion on a scale that could involve hundreds of millions of dollars. Her investigation had led her to Pierce Holdings, but she needed inside information from someone who understood the company's operations well enough to explain how legitimate investment activities might be masking illegal financial manipulation. Samuel found Claire, or perhaps she found him, through the network of former building employees who had been dismissed, restructured, or pressured out of their positions over the past several years. Their first meeting was at a diner in Pilsen, where Samuel was working part-time as a busboy while continuing his search for full-time employment. Claire approached him during his lunch break, explaining her investigation and asking if he would be willing to share his observations about Pierce Holdings' operations. What Claire didn't expect was the USB drive that Samuel had kept safe for over a year, waiting for the right moment and the right person to ensure that truth would be heard by those with the power to act on it. The security footage of the vase incident was only the beginning. Samuel's remarkable memory and his access to the building's operations had given him insights into financial irregularities that even Claire's extensive investigation had missed. Together, they began assembling a comprehensive picture of corporate malfeasance that stretched from cryptocurrency money laundering to tax evasion schemes involving offshore accounts in countries with strict banking secrecy laws. Samuel's quiet observations provided context for transactions that had seemed legitimate in isolation, but revealed patterns of illegal activity when analyzed as part of a larger scheme. The story that Claire published on a cold Tuesday morning in February, exactly 2 years after the vase incident, was front-page news in the Chicago Tribune and was picked up by financial news services across the country. The headline was simple but devastating. Local hedge fund manager accused of $50 million cryptocurrency money laundering scheme. The subheading was even more damaging. Former employee provides evidence of systematic tax evasion and fraudulent investment practices. The article included the security footage that proved Samuel's innocence in the vase incident, but more importantly, it contained financial evidence that suggested Pierce Holdings had been operating as a criminal organization disguised as a legitimate investment firm. The story detailed how cryptocurrency transactions had been structured to avoid regulatory oversight, how offshore accounts had been used to hide profits from tax authorities, and how legitimate investors had been unknowingly funding illegal activities through their participation in Pierce's hedge fund. The reaction was swift and comprehensive. Federal agents served search warrants at Pierce Holdings offices before the financial markets opened, seizing computers, documents, and files that contained evidence of crimes spanning nearly a decade. Pierce's personal assets were frozen pending investigation. His passport was confiscated to prevent flight to non-extradition countries, and his photograph appeared on television news broadcasts, alongside the kind of coverage usually reserved for organized crime figures and international terrorists. The victims of Pierce's schemes included not only the investors who had trusted him with their retirement savings and their children's college funds, but also the employees who had been systematically abused, intimidated, and discarded whenever they posed inconvenient questions about the ethics of their working environment. Samuel's vindication was part of a larger story about power, accountability, and the price that society pays when wealth and influence are allowed to operate without oversight or consequences. For Samuel, watching the news coverage from his small apartment in Pilsen, the satisfaction was quiet and profound. Not because Pierce was finally facing consequences for his actions, but because truth had been preserved and justice was being served through proper channels rather than through revenge or vigilantism. The dignity that Samuel had maintained throughout his ordeal, his refusal to become bitter, his patience in waiting for the right moment to act, his trust in the ultimate power of truth, had been vindicated in ways that even he hadn't dared to hope. The phone call came on a Wednesday evening in March, nearly 3 months after the Tribune story had transformed Pierce from a respected businessman into a federal defendant awaiting trial. Samuel recognized the voice immediately. It was Marcus Washington, the security guard whose cowardice had helped frame Samuel for the vase incident. Marcus's call was brief and awkward, a stammered apology that seemed motivated more by fear of legal liability than genuine remorse, but it represented an acknowledgement of truth that had been denied for too long. More meaningful was the letter that arrived 2 days later, handwritten on expensive stationery and signed by Patricia Pierce, Roland's ex-wife, who had divorced him 6 months earlier when the extent of his financial crimes became apparent to those closest to him. Patricia's letter was an apology for her own silence during Samuel's ordeal, an acknowledgement that she had witnessed the incident with the vase and had known the truth, but had been too concerned with protecting her own financial interests to speak up when her testimony could have made a difference. But the conversation that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Roland Pierce himself, calling from the federal holding facility where he was awaiting trial after being denied bail due to flight risk concerns. Pierce's call was brief and painful, his once authoritative voice reduced to a whisper of its former power. There were no excuses, no attempts to minimize his responsibility, no efforts to manipulate or deceive. Just a simple acknowledgement. "You were right, Samuel, about everything. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." Samuel listened to Pierce's apology with the same quiet dignity he had brought to every aspect of their relationship, from the daily interactions in the Parkside Tower lobby to this final conversation between a man who had lost everything and a man who had found something more valuable than money, vindication through truth rather than revenge. "I forgive you," Samuel said, and meant it. Not because Pierce deserved forgiveness, but because Samuel understood that carrying hatred was a burden that would ultimately hurt him more than it would hurt Pierce. Dignity, Samuel had learned, sometimes meant choosing grace even when justice would have been more satisfying. The rebuilding of Samuel's life began with a phone call from Margaret Chen, the new building manager who had been hired to oversee Parkside Tower's operations after Pierce Holdings' collapse had left the building's ownership in legal limbo. Margaret had read Claire Wu's Tribune article and had been specifically seeking to hire Samuel for a position that would utilize his extensive knowledge of the building's systems and his demonstrated integrity under pressure. The job offer was for Head of Building Security and Compliance, a newly created position designed to ensure that Parkside Tower's operations would be transparent, ethical, and accountable to both residents and regulatory authorities. The salary was nearly double what Samuel had earned as a custodian, but more importantly, the position came with respect, authority, and recognition of his value as both an employee and a human being. Samuel's return to Parkside Tower was quiet, but symbolically powerful. The same marble lobby where he had been humiliated now welcomed him as a key figure in the building's management structure. His office, small but well-appointed, adjoined the security center where he could monitor the building's operations and ensure that the interests of all residents wealthy and modest alike, were protected equally. The changes Samuel implemented were subtle but significant. Security procedures were revised to eliminate the arbitrary power that had allowed guards to discriminate based on appearance or perceived social status. Staff training programs were instituted to ensure that all employees understood their responsibility to treat every visitor with dignity and respect, regardless of their economic circumstances. Most importantly, reporting procedures were established to protect whistleblowers and ensure that concerns about unethical or illegal activities could be raised without fear of retaliation. Clara Morales visited Samuel during his first week in the new position, bringing coffee and gratitude for the defense that had cost him so much, but had ultimately led to justice being served. Her own company, Cartwell Technologies, had survived the difficult early years and had secured several major contracts with investors who valued ethical business practices over maximum short-term profits. Clara's success was modest compared to the vast wealth that had once filled Parkside Tower, but it was sustainable, honest, and built on foundations that would support long-term growth rather than spectacular collapse. The conversations between Samuel and Clara became regular occurrences, discussing not only building security, but also broader questions about business ethics, social responsibility, and the kind of society they wanted to help create through their daily choices and professional activities. These discussions attracted other building residents and employees, creating an informal community of people committed to conducting business with integrity and treating all individuals with the respect due to fellow human beings. Years passed, and Samuel aged into the role of elder statesman within the Parkside Tower community. His hair grew gray, then white, but his eyes remained sharp and his memory remained extraordinary. New residents learned quickly that Samuel Martinez was someone whose opinions carried weight, whose recommendations were trustworthy, and whose presence ensured that the building's operations would be conducted with fairness and transparency. The building itself seemed to settle into a more comfortable rhythm under Samuel's watchful care. The marble floors still gleamed, but they no longer reflected the cold arrogance of unchecked wealth. The elevators still carried residents to their offices and apartments, but conversations during those brief vertical journeys were more likely to focus on community concerns and social responsibility than on stock options and cryptocurrency speculation. Samuel's modest apartment in Pilsen remained his sanctuary, but Parkside Tower had become something more than just a workplace. It had become a demonstration that dignity, integrity, and respect for truth could transform even the most cynical environments if given the opportunity to take root and grow. The story of Samuel Martinez spread beyond the walls of Parkside Tower, carried by journalists like Claire Wu, who understood that individual acts of courage and integrity could inspire broader social change. Samuel was invited to speak at conferences about workplace ethics, labor rights, and the importance of protecting whistleblowers who risk their livelihoods to expose corruption and abuse of power. But Samuel's greatest satisfaction came not from public recognition, but from the quiet knowledge that he had remained true to his principles throughout an ordeal that would have broken lesser men. He had refused to compromise his dignity when pressed to accept blame for others' mistakes. He had chosen patience over revenge when he possessed the power to destroy his tormentors. He had selected truth over personal advantage when he could have used his knowledge for blackmail or personal enrichment. Most importantly, Samuel had demonstrated that wisdom and moral authority are not privileges reserved for the wealthy and powerful, but qualities that can be cultivated by anyone willing to observe carefully, think clearly, and act with integrity regardless of personal cost. His example had inspired others, building employees, residents, and community members to hold themselves to higher standards and to speak up when they witnessed injustice or corruption. The lesson of Samuel's story resonated far beyond the marble halls of Parkside Tower, reaching people throughout Chicago and across the country who recognized themselves in his quiet dignity and patient endurance. He had become a symbol of the truth that had always been evident to those willing to see it. That character cannot be purchased with money, that integrity is worth more than cryptocurrency portfolios, and that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one with the humblest title and the strongest moral compass. On a spring morning 10 years after his return to Parkside Tower, Samuel Martinez stood in the lobby where he had once been humiliated for defending a stranger's right to be treated with dignity. The marble floors still reflected the morning sunlight streaming through the glass doors, but the atmosphere had been transformed from one of cold indifference to warm community. Building residents greeted Samuel by name, security staff sought his advice on complex situations, and new employees learned from his example that their work had dignity and importance regardless of their position on the organizational chart. Samuel's story had become part of the building's history, passed down to each new generation of workers and residents as a reminder that individual choices matter, that standing up for what is right is always worthwhile, and that the qualities that make us truly wealthy, integrity, compassion, courage, and wisdom, cannot be measured in bank account balances or investment portfolios. The morning sun climbed higher over Chicago, casting longer shadows across the marble floor where Samuel continued his work with the same quiet dedication he had brought to every day of his career. But now his work was recognized, valued, and respected by those around him. He had transformed from an invisible man into a visible symbol of the truth that dignity is earned through character rather than purchased with money, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not through dramatic gestures, but through patient persistence and unwavering commitment to what is right. As the business day began and the elevators filled with people pursuing their various dreams and ambitions, Samuel Martinez remained at his post, no longer invisible, no longer ignored, but finally seen and appreciated for who he had always been, a man whose quiet strength and moral clarity had the power to transform not only his own circumstances, but the entire environment in which he served. But Samuel's influence extended far beyond the corridors of Parkside Tower. His story had reached Carlos Mendoza, a young janitor working in another downtown office building who faced daily humiliation from executives who treated him as if he were invisible. Carlos had read about Samuel in the Tribune and realized that he too had been documenting questionable practices, environmental violations, unsafe working conditions, and systematic wage theft that affected dozens of service workers who cleaned the offices where Chicago's financial elite made their fortunes. Inspired by Samuel's example, Carlos began reaching out to other service workers throughout the city, sharing information and building networks of communication that had never existed before. They discovered patterns of abuse that crossed multiple industries and companies, all connected by the same attitudes that had nearly destroyed Samuel's career, the belief that people who performed manual labor were somehow less deserving of respect, dignity, and fair treatment. The network that emerged became known as the Chicago Service Workers Alliance, an unofficial organization that combined the observational skills of custodians, security guards, maintenance workers, and food service employees with the investigative resources of journalists like Claire Wu and legal support from civil rights attorneys who understood that workplace dignity was fundamentally a human rights issue. Samuel found himself in the unexpected role of mentor and advisor to dozens of workers who faced situations similar to what he had experienced at Parkside Tower. His apartment in Pilsen became an unofficial counseling center where people gathered to share their stories, document their experiences, and find the courage to speak truth to power, even when the personal cost might be enormous. Maria Santos, a cleaning lady at a major law firm, brought evidence of sexual harassment and discrimination that the firm's partners had been covering up for years. Roberto Torres, a security guard at a cryptocurrency trading company, provided documentation of after-hours meetings where illegal market manipulation was planned and executed. Linda Jefferson, A cafeteria worker at an investment bank shared recordings of conversations where senior executives discussed bribing government officials to influence financial regulations. Each story added another layer to the growing understanding that the problems Samuel had faced were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a broader cultural disease, the systematic dehumanization of working people by those who had accumulated wealth and power through their labor. Samuel's patient listening and sage advice helped each worker understand that their individual experiences were part of a larger pattern, and that collective action was more powerful than isolated resistance. The second major investigation began almost accidentally, when 3 different workers from 3 different buildings reported similar suspicious activities involving cryptocurrency transactions and offshore banking. Carlos Mendoza had noticed unusual patterns of computer activity during after-hours trading sessions. Maria Santos had seen documents containing account numbers from banks in countries known for their banking secrecy laws. Roberto Torres had observed meetings between cryptocurrency executives and individuals who appeared to be foreign nationals conducting business that required unusual levels of security and confidentiality. Samuel helped them understand that what they were witnessing was likely a coordinated money laundering operation that used multiple Chicago financial institutions to move hundreds of millions of dollars through cryptocurrency exchanges and into offshore accounts where the funds could be used for activities that would be illegal if conducted through traditional banking channels. The investigation that followed was more complex and dangerous than the original Pierce Holdings case. The criminal organization involved had connections to international money laundering networks, political corruption schemes, and the kind of organized crime that could make witnesses disappear permanently. But Samuel's network had grown stronger and more sophisticated, with connections to federal law enforcement agencies and investigative journalists in multiple cities. The breakthrough came when Linda Jefferson discovered a USB drive that had been carelessly discarded in a wastebasket at the investment bank where she worked. The drive contained encryption keys and transaction records that proved beyond doubt that several major Chicago financial institutions had been knowingly participating in an international money laundering scheme involving cryptocurrency trading, political bribery, and tax evasion on a scale that dwarfed the Pierce Holdings case. The evidence was so comprehensive and disturbing that Claire Wu's initial story required coordination with federal prosecutors to ensure that the criminal investigation wouldn't be compromised by premature media coverage. When the story finally broke, it appeared simultaneously in major newspapers across the country and triggered the largest financial crime investigation in Chicago's history. The arrests began before dawn on a Tuesday morning in October, 5 years after Samuel's return to Parkside Tower. FBI agents served warrants at 17 different locations throughout the city, seizing computer servers, bank records, and cryptocurrency mining equipment worth millions of dollars. The investigation ultimately revealed a criminal network that had been operating for nearly a decade, stealing money from legitimate investors and using Chicago's financial infrastructure to support illegal activities in multiple countries. Samuel watched the news coverage from his office at Parkside Tower, surrounded by members of the Service Workers Alliance who had gathered to witness the fruits of their collective effort to hold powerful people accountable for their crimes. The satisfaction was different from his earlier vindication, deeper and more complex because it represented not just personal justice, but systemic change that would protect countless other workers from the abuses they had endured. The legal proceedings that followed lasted for nearly 3 years, as prosecutors worked to untangle the complex web of financial crimes and identify all the participants in the money laundering network. Samuel testified in multiple trials, his exceptional memory and detailed documentation providing crucial evidence that helped convict dozens of defendants on charges ranging from tax evasion to racketeering. But the most significant changes were cultural rather than legal. The publicity surrounding the Service Workers Alliance and their role in exposing major financial crimes had shifted public opinion about the value and dignity of service work. Companies throughout Chicago began implementing new policies designed to protect workers from harassment and discrimination, recognizing that treating employees with respect was not only morally correct but also essential for preventing the kind of whistleblower revelations that could destroy corporate reputations overnight. Samuel's position at Parkside Tower evolved again as his reputation for integrity and wisdom spread throughout Chicago's business community. He became a consultant for companies that wanted to ensure their workplace cultures were ethical and sustainable, helping executives understand that dignity and respect for all employees weren't just nice ideas, but practical necessities for long-term success. The consulting work took Samuel into corporate boardrooms where he had once been invisible, giving presentations to executives who now recognized that the people who cleaned their offices might also be the people who could expose their secrets if those secrets involved illegal or unethical activities. His message was always the same. Treat people with dignity, not because you're afraid of what they might know, but because dignity is the foundation of any organization worth being part of. During these years of growing recognition and influence, Samuel never forgot the lessons he had learned during his darkest period of unemployment and humiliation. He continued to live in his modest apartment in Pilsen, continued to take public transportation to work, and continued to treat every person he encountered, regardless of their position or wealth, with the same respect and attention that he had always believed every human being deserved. His personal relationships deepened during this period as well. His friendship with Clara Morales evolved into something approaching family, with Clara often joining Samuel for Sunday dinners where they would discuss not only their professional work, but their shared commitment to creating a more just and equitable society. Clara's company, Cartwell Technologies, had grown considerably, but she had maintained the ethical principles that had attracted Samuel's support during their first encounter in the Parkside Tower lobby. Samuel also developed a close relationship with Mrs. Esperanza, his elderly neighbor who had sustained him with tamales and encouragement during his months of unemployment. As Mrs. Esperanza's health declined, Samuel became her primary caregiver, accompanying her to medical appointments and ensuring that she received the dignity and respect that the healthcare system too often denied to elderly patients without insurance or family advocates. These relationships reminded Samuel daily that individual acts of kindness and respect created ripple effects that could transform entire communities. The same attention to human dignity that had motivated his defense of Clara Morales now guided his care for Mrs. Esperanza, his mentorship of young workers like Carlos Mendoza, and his consulting work with corporations that were learning to value integrity alongside profitability. Samuel's 70th birthday was celebrated not with a private party, but with a community gathering in the Pilsen neighborhood center, where hundreds of people came to honor the man whose quiet courage had inspired a movement for workplace dignity and corporate accountability. The attendees included former victims of workplace abuse who had found their voices through the Service Workers Alliance, executives who had learned from Samuel's consulting work to create more ethical corporate cultures, and community members who had been touched by his simple philosophy that every person deserves respect regardless of their economic circumstances or social position. The speakers at the celebration represented the broad impact Samuel's life had made across different sectors of society. Claire Wu spoke about how Samuel's willingness to preserve and share truth had changed not only individual lives, but entire systems of corporate governance. Carlos Mendoza discussed how Samuel's example had inspired a generation of service workers to understand that their observations and experiences had value beyond their immediate job responsibilities. Margaret Chen, now the regional manager for multiple office buildings throughout Chicago, explained how Samuel's security and compliance protocols had become models for property management companies across the Midwest, reducing workplace harassment, improving employee satisfaction, and creating more productive and profitable business environments. Most meaningful to Samuel was the presentation by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a professor of business ethics at Northwestern University, who had studied the Service Workers Alliance as an example of how grassroots organizing could create systemic change in corporate behavior. Dr. Rodriguez announced that the university was establishing the Samuel Martinez Fellowship for Workplace Dignity, a program that would provide financial support for students studying the intersection of business ethics, labor rights, and social justice. The fellowship represented something Samuel had never expected, but had always hoped for: the institutionalization of the principles he had lived by and fought for throughout his career. Future generations of business leaders would study his example and learn that success measured only in financial terms was ultimately hollow, while success that included respect for human dignity created value that could last for generations. But perhaps the most touching moment of the celebration came when James Murphy, the former courier whose cart had caught on the marble floor and caused the vase to shatter, approached Samuel with a handwritten letter of gratitude. James had struggled for years with guilt about the incident, knowing that his carelessness had led to Samuel being blamed and fired from a job he loved. The vindication that came through Claire Wu's investigation had freed James from that guilt. But more importantly, Samuel's example had inspired James to become an advocate for workplace safety and dignity in the logistics industry where he had continued to work. James had used his insider knowledge of package delivery operations to help expose unsafe working conditions, wage theft, and discrimination in an industry that employed hundreds of thousands of workers across the country. His efforts had led to improved safety regulations, better compensation structures, and more respect for workers whose labor kept commerce flowing smoothly throughout the economy. The conversation between Samuel and James was brief but profound. Two men whose lives had been forever changed by a moment of accidental destruction that had ultimately revealed deeper truths about power, accountability, and the connections between individual choices and systemic justice. They spoke not about the past, but about their shared commitment to ensuring that future workers would be protected from the kinds of abuses they had both experienced. As the celebration continued into the evening, Samuel reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought him from the invisible custodian in Parkside Tower to a respected advocate for workplace dignity, whose influence extended throughout American corporate culture. The transformation had not been easy or quick, requiring decades of patient observation, careful documentation, and the courage to speak truth even when doing so carried enormous personal risk. Yet, Samuel understood that his individual story was meaningful, primarily as an example of possibilities that existed for anyone willing to live with integrity and treat others with dignity regardless of their own circumstances. The real heroes of the story were the countless workers who had found their voices, the journalists who had chosen truth over convenience, the prosecutors who had pursued justice regardless of the power of defendants, and the executives who had learned that ethical behavior was not only morally correct, but also practically necessary for sustainable success. The legacy that Samuel hoped to leave was not his individual success, but the broader understanding that respect for human dignity was the foundation of any healthy society, whether that society existed in corporate boardrooms, neighborhood communities, or the larger democratic institutions that governed American life. His example proved that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to observe carefully, think clearly, and act with courage, guided by moral principles rather than personal advantage. The following Monday morning, Samuel returned to work at Parkside Tower with the same quiet dedication he had brought to every job throughout his career. The marble floors still reflected the morning sunlight, the elevators still carried residents and workers to their various destinations, and the building still hummed with the energy of people pursuing their dreams and ambitions. But the atmosphere had been permanently transformed by the recognition that everyone who worked in the building, from the executive suites to the service corridors, deserved respect, dignity, and fair treatment. Samuel's office had become a destination for visitors from other cities who wanted to learn about the Parkside Tower model of ethical workplace culture. Delegations of business leaders, labor organizers, and government officials regularly toured the building to observe how respect for worker dignity could be integrated with profitable business operations and regulatory compliance. These visitors often expressed surprise that the architect of such significant systemic change continued to live modestly and work with the same hands-on dedication that had characterized his career as a custodian. Samuel would explain patiently that real leadership meant serving others rather than being served by them, and that understanding the daily realities of work at every level of an organization was essential for creating policies that actually improved working conditions rather than simply looking good in corporate reports. The Service Workers Alliance had evolved from an informal support network into a formal organization with chapters in multiple cities and connections to labor unions, civil rights groups, and investigative journalism organizations throughout the country. Samuel served on the advisory board, but insisted that leadership positions be filled by younger workers who were closer to the daily challenges faced by service employees in various industries. The Alliance had documented and helped expose workplace abuses in industries ranging from healthcare to hospitality, manufacturing to financial services. Their success had inspired similar organizations in other countries, creating an international network of workers who shared information, supported each other during difficult investigations, and celebrated victories for workplace dignity wherever they occurred. Samuel's role in this larger movement remained what it had always been: patient listener, careful observer, and trusted advisor who helped others find their voices and understand the broader significance of their individual experiences. He never sought credit for the Alliance's successes, understanding that sustainable change required deep roots in many communities rather than dependence on any individual leader or organization. His consulting work had evolved as well, moving beyond individual companies to include work with government agencies, educational institutions, and international organizations that were grappling with questions of workplace ethics and human dignity in the global economy. Samuel's insights, grounded in decades of direct experience with both the problems and the solutions, provided practical wisdom that complemented academic research and policy analysis. The common thread running through all of Samuel's work was his insistence that abstract principles like dignity, integrity, and respect had to be translated into concrete policies, specific behaviors, and measurable outcomes. It wasn't enough, he would tell his audiences, to say that an organization valued human dignity. That value had to be demonstrated through hiring practices, workplace policies, response to complaints, and the daily interactions between people at different levels of organizational hierarchies. Samuel's health remained remarkably good well into his 70s, sustained by a lifetime of physical work, strong community relationships, and the deep satisfaction that comes from meaningful work aligned with personal values. His daily routine still included walks through his Pilsen neighborhood, conversations with longtime friends and neighbors, and the kind of simple pleasures, good food, interesting books, beautiful music, that reminded him why dignity and justice were worth fighting for. But he was also realistic about aging and mortality, and had begun working with Clara Morales and other younger colleagues to ensure that the principles and practices he had developed would survive his eventual retirement or death. The Samuel Martinez Fellowship at Northwestern University was part of this transition planning, but equally important were the detailed documentation of best practices, the training programs for workplace advocates, and the institutional relationships that would continue to support workers who found themselves in situations similar to what Samuel had faced at Parkside Tower. The mentorship relationships Samuel maintained with dozens of younger workers had become one of his greatest sources of joy and meaning. Watching Carlos Mendoza develop from an intimidated janitor into a confident advocate for workers' rights, seeing Maria Santos complete her college degree while continuing to work as a cleaning lady and expose workplace abuses, observing Roberto Torres become a respected expert on financial crime whose testimony had helped convict multiple defendants in federal court. These transformations reminded Samuel that his individual story had meaning primarily as part of a larger narrative about human potential and social change. Each mentoring relationship taught Samuel something new about the challenges facing contemporary workers and the evolving tactics used by employers who wanted to avoid accountability for their treatment of employees. The basic patterns remained depressingly consistent. Workers who observed illegal or unethical behavior were intimidated into silence, blamed for problems they had tried to solve, or fired for asking inconvenient questions about workplace policies. But Samuel was encouraged by the growing sophistication of worker organizing, the increasing willingness of journalists to investigate corporate crime, and the gradual recognition among progressive business leaders that ethical behavior was essential for long-term success in an interconnected global economy where information traveled instantly and corporate reputations could be destroyed overnight. The transformation of Parkside Tower had become a case study taught in business schools, law schools, and graduate programs in public administration throughout the United States and internationally. Students studied how Samuel's careful documentation and patient persistence had exposed financial crimes worth hundreds of millions of dollars, how the Service Workers Alliance had created new models for worker organizing, and how changes in corporate culture had improved both employee satisfaction and business performance. What made Samuel's story particularly compelling to students was its demonstration that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to act with courage, guided by clear moral principles. Unlike many business case studies that focused on the decisions of wealthy executives or famous entrepreneurs, Samuel's story showed how someone with modest resources and no formal authority could create systemic change by choosing integrity over convenience and community solidarity over individual advancement. The academic interest in Samuel's story had led to speaking invitations at universities throughout the country, where he would address students preparing for careers in business, law, journalism, and public service. His presentations always emphasized practical applications rather than abstract theory, focusing on specific behaviors and decisions that students could implement in their own careers, regardless of their chosen profession or level of responsibility. Samuel would remind his student audiences that they would face moments throughout their careers when they would have to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right, between protecting their own interests and protecting the interests of others who had less power or fewer resources. The choices they made in those moments would ultimately determine not only their individual character, but the kind of society they helped create through their professional work. The questions students asked after his presentations often focused on practical concerns about the personal costs of ethical behavior. How to speak up about workplace problems without losing their jobs, how to maintain integrity while still achieving career success, how to balance personal ambition with social responsibility. Samuel's answers drew on his decades of experience navigating these tensions, offering specific strategies while acknowledging that ethical behavior sometimes required real sacrifice and that doing the right thing didn't always lead to immediate rewards. But Samuel also emphasized that the long-term rewards of ethical behavior, deeper relationships, lasting satisfaction, positive impact on others, were worth short-term costs, and that compromising one's principles for immediate advantage often led to hollow success that couldn't provide genuine fulfillment or meaning. His own life provided evidence that it was possible to achieve recognition, influence, and financial security while maintaining integrity and treating all people with dignity and respect. As Samuel approached his 75th birthday, He began to think more seriously about retirement and the legacy he wanted to leave through his remaining years of work. The Service Workers Alliance was thriving under younger leadership. His consulting practice was successfully training the next generation of workplace ethics experts, and the institutional changes he had helped create were becoming standard practice throughout Chicago's business community. Yet, Samuel remained energized by his daily work and the ongoing opportunities to make a difference in individual lives and broader social systems. Each week brought new challenges: young workers seeking advice about hostile workplace situations, journalists investigating corporate corruption, executives wanting guidance on creating ethical organizational cultures, policymakers designing regulations to protect whistleblowers and prevent workplace abuse. The variety and importance of this work convinced Samuel that retirement, while eventually inevitable, should be postponed as long as his health and energy remained strong. He had learned too much and developed too many valuable relationships to step away from opportunities to contribute to positive social change. His experience had taught him that wisdom gained through decades of careful observation and moral courage was too precious to waste. Samuel's continuing presence at Parkside Tower served as a daily reminder to everyone who worked in the building that dignity, integrity, and respect for truth were not just abstract ideals, but practical necessities for any organization that wanted to achieve sustainable success while treating all its members with the respect due to fellow human beings. His example continued to inspire both individual ethical behavior and institutional policy changes that protected workers from the kinds of abuses that had once seemed inevitable and unchangeable. The marble floors of Parkside Tower still gleamed each morning as Samuel arrived for work, but they now reflected something more beautiful than expensive surfaces. They reflected a community that had learned to value character as much as capital, dignity as much as dividends, and truth as much as profit. Samuel Martinez had transformed from an invisible custodian into a visible symbol of the possibility that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they chose courage over comfort and justice over convenience. And you, have you ever felt invisible while you were the one holding everything together? Have you been blamed for problems you didn't create, dismissed for speaking truth that others didn't want to hear, or humiliated simply for trying to do what was right? Have you wondered if anyone notices the dignity you carry in your daily work, regardless of your job title or salary? Tell me your story in the comments below. Share the moments when you chose integrity over convenience, when you stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves, or when you found strength in patience while waiting for truth to be recognized. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it can reach others who also deserve to be seen and valued for who they truly are. For more stories that honor the quiet heroes among us, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this journey with Samuel Martinez and with all of us who understand that real wealth is measured not in dollars or Bitcoin, but in the dignity we maintain and the truth we preserve even when no one else is watching. We'll see you in the next story, where invisible hands and quiet hearts continue to hold our world together.